Good evening and welcome to Tysky Sour. We have two huge stories for you this evening. Both would have, in usual times, led the show, but we live in extraordinary times. One, as you know, England has gone into, or is about to go into, a second lockdown, going against everything that the government has been so enthusiastically shouting for the past few weeks, which is that a national lockdown would be the worst possible option we could have. We're now going into one. It just happens to be a little bit too late. And second, what I thought was going to lead tonight's show, the US elections are tomorrow. But that has been knocked off the top spot by the lockdown. We will be speaking to Sarah Jaffe, Labour journalist, friend of the show, live from Pennsylvania, which is really going to be the key state in tomorrow's elections. I should also say that there's a third big story, a third big event that tonight's show will witness. That's because Ash Sarkar is back from her struggle with coronavirus. How are you doing, Ash?
Bang. You thought you could kill me. You thought you could take me out, but you were
fully recovered. Fully recovered? Any signs of long COVID, or are you sort of back to your sprightly self?
Well, I feel it's weird, right? So I definitely feel much better. I don't have a fever anymore, which is a sign that the active infection has gone. But I definitely feel more tired than I normally would. And I have some chest pains, which can't really be put down to anything else. But it might be that that's a symptom of, ongoing corona issues, or it could just be existential dread. Who knows?
How's your taste, smell? That's supposed to be the key hangover.
Okay, yeah, I still don't have my taste or smell fully back, but it comes in little waves. So you get these like phantom smells where you think that you've smelled something. You're just like left sniffing the air like a bloodhound, trying to like get that whiff of drain cleaner or whatever it may be.
All right, we're going to go straight on to our first story. You know the score. Tweet on the hashtag TyskySour and share the show link. Facing down advice from their own scientists and demands from the opposition, Boris Johnson's government have spent the past month explaining why they would not back national measures to restrict the spread of coronavirus. However, with modelling suggesting that hospitals could breach surge capacity within a matter of weeks, our Prime Minister has been forced into a dramatic U-turn. Here he is explaining the new measures at Saturday's impromptu and much delayed Downing Street press conference.
From Thursday until the start of December, you must stay at home. You may only leave home for specific reasons, including for education, for work, let's say if you cannot work from home, for exercise and recreation outdoors with your household or on your own with one person from another household, for medical reasons, appointments, and to escape injury or harm, to shop for food and essentials, and to provide care for vulnerable people or as a volunteer. I'm afraid non-essential shops, leisure and entertainment venues will all be closed, though click and collect services can continue and essential shops will remain open, so there's no need to stock up. Pubs, bars, restaurants must close except for takeaway and delivery services. Workplaces should stay open where people can't work from home, for example, in the construction and manufacturing sectors. Single adult households can still form exclusive support bubbles with one other household, and children will still be able to move between homes if their parents are separated. If you're clinically vulnerable or over the age of 60, you should be especially careful to follow the rules and minimise your contacts with others. I know how tough shielding was, and we will not ask people to shield again in the same way, but we are asking those who are clinically extremely vulnerable to minimise their contact with others and not to go to work if they're unable to work from.
So Boris Johnson not looking, too happy to be delivering that dramatic U-turn. I suppose the important things to point out are that there are some key differences to the spring lockdown. Basically, other than these, it's exactly the same. So they've said that schools and universities will remain open. We'll be speaking about that later in the show with Gabriel Scally. That is, a big, significant open question about how well this lockdown can work whilst educational institutions remain open. He also talked about shielding not being reintroduced, and single adult households are allowed to form bubbles. That wasn't in place at the start of the spring lockdown. What people are rightly taking umbrage with is when he said that now is the time to take action because there is no alternative. Why that rubbed me up the wrong way, actually, is because the reason there is no alternative to this incredibly damaging lockdown is that Johnson refused to take any meaningful action when we still had time to avoid something as drastic as this. This graphic from The Independent, which is on their online front page for Sunday, demonstrates how much has been cost by Johnson's tardiness on this particular issue. So if you look here, what they've done is they've sort of mapped the dates of different events with the spread of the coronavirus. So you can see on the 21st of September, that's when SAGE, the government scientific advisors, first recommended a circuit breaker. At that point in time, there were 5,000 daily infections. The government ignored it. The government refused to adopt that policy. 7th of October, Scotland lays out new restrictions, which many people are saying this looks quite like a circuit breaker. 12th of October, Chris Whitty warns tier 3 isn't enough to control coronavirus. The government sticks with that policy. 13th of October, Labour call for a circuit breaker. 14th, the scientists warn situation is already exceeding worst case scenario. 19th of October, Wales announces firebreak, and it's not until the 31st of October, this Saturday, when there are more than 20,000 infections per day, that the government has finally conceded to the reality that you can't contain this incredibly dangerous virus by just telling people that if they go to the pub and buy a pint, they'll have to also order a pie. It's frustrating that we're in exactly the same situation as we were back in March, a government which acts later than it could have done, which means that more extreme and more long-lasting lockdown measures are needed. Now, given quite how much advice and information has been ignored, it's a little surprising Johnson had the cheek to say this on Saturday.
I'm afraid no responsible Prime Minister can ignore the message of those figures.
Boris, we entirely agree. Ash, this is a real deja vu, right? So we've got a government which, like in March, has delayed the inevitable. It's going to mean more deaths and more damage to the economy. How did we get here again?
Well, we got here again because we've got the same government and it's incompetent. And you can see its incompetence manifested in 3 very distinct ways. So the first is that it is completely inadequate when it comes to constructing and maintaining pandemic response infrastructure. So testing, contact tracing, enforcing isolation, all of those kinds of things are a complete mess. They're a mess in March when community testing had to be suspended. Things like getting adequate PPE to the right places, that was a mess in March. And over the summer, when people still lived under restrictions and infections were low, you didn't have huge increases in the effectiveness of contact tracing. In fact, what you had was then the next problem, which is a problem of sequencing. We had the economy reopen, people encouraged to pile into Nando's when you didn't have an effective test, trace and isolate system set up. So it meant that people were being encouraged to get back into these spaces in which infections are highly likely, and you didn't have a system which was capable of identifying those outbreaks and acting quickly on it. And that brings me to my third problem, which is a problem of responsiveness. So you've got a government which has hamstrung itself in terms of the availability of data, which can tell you something about where infections are taking place and where. And you've also got a problem of ideology. You've got different voices in the cabinet who are advocating for different things and different priorities. So you've got the Rishi Sunaks of the world who are pushing this really false opposition between the preservation of life and the health of the economy. Now, anyone with a molecule of common sense could tell you that having tens of thousands of people die in a pandemic isn't very good for the economy either. But Sunak very much is of the mind that, you keep the economy functioning for as long as you can, and that's what's ultimately going to be better. And so what we've ended up with really is the worst of all worlds. We don't have a government which is able to be responsive quickly enough so you can come in with these short, sharp circuit breaker lockdowns. You don't have data which is reliable enough to make policy decisions on, and you've also got an economy which is going to take far greater hits because you're going to have these really draconian national lockdowns for much longer periods of time, because it's going to take longer to control the virus again and get the reproduction rate as low as you possibly can. So that's why we're trapped in this kind of Groundhog Day. It's because all of the very flawed forms of thinking, which meant that we went into lockdown late in March, they weren't really challenged. The government kind of feel that they got away with botching the pandemic management the first time around, and they were given no real reason to have to change.
Graphic free, Fox, because if you watched that, I expect many of you watched that press conference live, and there was, quite scary projections from the chief scientific advisor and the chief medical officer. But you hear people on Twitter, the projections are always wrong. One, the projections do usually turn out to be fairly accurate, but two, you don't need projections at this point. So we can look here at the number of people in hospital with coronavirus each day, and you can look at that, and because I remember, the last month I've spent shows sort of saying, look, it's increasing, but when you compare it to that absolute peak, it's still much smaller in comparison than how bad it was. And you can see somehow we've sleepwalked into this situation where the second peak looks almost exactly like the first. And I mean, it's projected that actually hospitals are going to be more full than they were the first time around, because we've left so long for this virus to circulate freely in society as winter has crept in. I want to now sort of focus on the extent to which this was a U-turn. The government will argue that the science has changed. I mean, they've slightly changed their line, actually. They haven't said the science has changed, which was their line in spring. What they have said is we have been humbled by nature. Slightly frustrating that nature should have humbled them about a month ago. It's been quite clear what's going to happen. But let's look at what they have been saying for the past month, because Starmer called for a circuit breaker in mid-October. That means that the Conservatives have very proactively been arguing against a circuit breaker since then. This is a tweet put out by the Tories on the 21st of October. So they write, Labour have admitted wanting repeated national lockdowns. Our approach will keep our country and its regions moving. Boris Johnson explains why at PMQs. We can take a look at that video.
Mr. Speaker, we will do whatever it takes to get this country through the crisis, with or without the support of the right honourable gentleman opposite. And I may say that I think that his policy, I've explained why I don't believe that his policy is the right one for the country, because it would involve closing schools, it would involve shuttering businesses, with all the psychological, the emotional damage that lockdown of that kind brings. He can't say how many circuit breakers he thinks would be necessary. He can't say how long they would go on. He can't say how much damage they would do to the UK economy and to people's mental health, Mr. Speaker. We, on the other hand, want to go on with our commonsensical approach, which is a local and a regional approach, keeping kids in school, keeping our economy moving, because that is the way to get the whole of our country through this crisis together, so that we all, and particularly those regions that are now, alas, under Tier 3 restrictions, all the regions of the country bounce back strongly together, Mr. Speaker.
Boris Johnson, though, a tub-thumping speech saying he can't tell us, Keir Starmer can't tell us how long his circuit breaker lockdown would last or how much damage it would do to the economy. Well, what we know now is that by avoiding the inevitable, we are going to have more damage to our economy, and the lockdown is going to have to last longer than it would otherwise have. They have also been pushing this line up until very recently. So this is Dominic Raab speaking to Sky on Friday.
But if you look at those who've advocated a national lockdown, including Keir Starmer, for example, but others, they've never been able to say how you get out of it. So the idea of a short, sharp circuit breaker is, frankly, something of an enigma. No one can say if you go into a national lockdown how, at what point you get out of it. So I think that would not only be damaging, it wouldn't be, in economic terms, it wouldn't be the targeted approach in epidemiological terms, and it would create great uncertainty. So we appreciate this is difficult. I know from my own constituency the challenges, the disruption, the inconvenience of being in the high tier, but it's better to take a targeted approach than have the blunt tool of nationwide restrictions at the very highest possible level, which I think a lot of people in those areas where the virus hasn't taken hold would think was unfair as well as ineffective.
I mean, you have to wonder, I mean, how dysfunctional is a government that sends out its foreign secretary on Friday to argue that we couldn't possibly impose a national lockdown, which would mean that people in the southwest where cases are low would have to be under the same conditions as people in the northwest where cases were high, and then announce exactly that policy the following days. As we know, this isn't because there were these projections which were a great surprise, which were just released. We have had the same advice from SAGE for about 6 weeks now, which is that you have to implement much more severe restrictions than you already have, because, as I've already said, you can't restrain, you can't suppress this deadly virus by just telling people that if you buy a pint, you're going to eat a pie with it. It's not how it works. Let's go to a few super chats. Joshua Crawley with a tenner. University staff being forced into the dark satanic mills. Glad to see at least the opposition has my back. We're going to go on to universities and schools in detail in a moment. Jack Murgatroyd, Manchester-based A&E doc and avid Navarra fan. Last week, furlough was just not financially feasible for the North, but fear not, London now involved and everything is all of a sudden possible. And Ben Graham with a tenner. Been watching Tysky Sour since the first lockdown was announced. Keep up the good work, Novara. Ash, I want your thoughts on that comment about the furlough scheme. So the furlough scheme has been reintroduced for just this month. 80% of wages, basically as it always was. But people are rightly pissed off that this is exactly what Andy Burnham has been asking for about 3 weeks. And the government have been saying, we can't possibly afford this. There's just not the money there. Now they're locking down other parts of the country. They've suddenly found the magic money tree. I mean, it's not a magic money tree. You can just borrow from the Bank of England. That's what we've been doing the whole time. But suddenly they've just realised that you can spend money when a public health disaster needs some financial support to go alongside the government response.
I mean, what we saw with Liverpool and Manchester is that they were really hung out to dry by this government. And that was the problem with the regional approach to locking down. It wasn't that there's anything wrong inherently with trying to keep things as localized as possible, is that was a pretext, essentially, to do things on the cheap and really screw over workers, right? That's what that was about. And suddenly when you have to lock down London as well, the Conservatives are very worried about essentially pissing off the financial powerhouse of this entire country. And there's no excuse anymore. They can't justify that to their donors. They can't justify that to their membership. They can't justify that to their voters. So I think that's an explanation for why you've seen this return to 80% furlough. But again, this is another example of the government doing what is inevitable at the very last minute with disastrous consequences. So it was literally at the 11th hour that the government U-turned on extending furlough. It was supposed to end on Sunday, and that's when it was, Saturday, Halloween, and that was precisely when the announcement to extend was made. Before that, Rishi Sunak had been insisting that there would be no extension to furlough. And what that meant is that lots of businesses had already made their plans, and that would have involved making thousands of workers redundant. Just anecdotally, on Saturday, I put out a tweet asking how many workers have been laid off already. And I got scores of replies from people who'd been being laid off all the way from August till now. So putting out that messaging already has had disastrous consequences. You're going to have people going into this lockdown without adequate financial support. They'll be reliant, if they've not been able to find alternative employment, which is really difficult to do in this kind of economic environment. They'll be reliant on the universal credit system, which we know is neither as generous nor as efficient as it should be. And that has real public health consequences.
On the epidemiological consequences of the delay, Andrew Hayward, who's Professor of Infectious Diseases and Epidemiology at University College London, also sits on SAGE, gave Radio 4's Today programme a very sort of revealing interview, quite a hard-hitting one, quite damning of the government's policy up to now. We can get up a couple of the key quotes from that. He says, well, we can't turn back the clock, but I think if we had chosen a 2-week circuit breaker at that time, which is when it was first asked for at the end of September, we would definitely have saved thousands of lives, and we would clearly have inflicted substantially less damage on our economy than the proposed 4-week lockdown will do. He continued, I think countries like ours that have failed to control COVID have seen they have the highest death rates and the greatest impact on the economy. And I think we have repeatedly underestimated COVID and done too little, too late really, to control the virus and save both lives and livelihoods. It's very hard to disagree with that depressing conclusion, I think. I'm not sure to what extent we're going to see a sort of all-out rebellion from the scientists, but they do seem a bit more willing to speak out publicly on the government's catastrophic response to this. And you have to say, the government's repeated. The government has made the same mistake twice. It's almost exactly the same what they have done. They've said, we're going to protect the economy by avoiding a lockdown. Then they have to implement a lockdown, but when it's too late, so we're going to be in it for too long, which is going to cause even more damage to the economy. And we're already going to have not hundreds of thousands, but hundreds and thousands of deaths locked in at this point. We are going to go on to what's different this time around about the lockdown in more detail. First of all, you're watching Tysky Sarah on Novara Media. Do make sure you hit that subscribe button. We're getting agonizingly close to 100,000 subscribers. And Aaron has actually informed me that when we do, we get this sort of little glass prize from YouTube. That's not the reason we do this, but it won't go amiss. A couple more comments. Fiona Summers with a tenner, sending cash to celebrate Ash's return. I'm declaring today Ash Monday. Thank you very much, Fiona. On behalf of Ash, probably. Yes, it's a good response. Kit Jones with a fiver to say thank you for successfully pushing Labour to vote against the Overseas Operations Bill. Novara was the only media outlet I noticed pushing this. You say successfully? Yeah, they did. Sorry, I was like, did they ever actually vote well on something? They did in the end on that, didn't they? And John Rueda with a fiver. Julian Assange's fate is Navarra Media's fate. His legal fight continues. Navarra Media should be discussing his situation in order to keep it in our collective consciousness. I mean, on one level, I thoroughly agree. I mean, we have been quite loud in arguing that the case against Julian Assange on this particular matter is completely out of order. They are persecuting a journalist. Well, they're persecuting here someone who leaked information, playing the role of a journalist for espionage, completely chilling. You can watch a documentary which we made on this, and we talked about it on a Tysky Sour very recently. January is when the verdict's going to come in. I'm sure we'll speak about it a lot more then. Let's now look at some of the ways this lockdown will supposedly differ from the last. So the first, what Boris Johnson was very keen to emphasise on Saturday was that this one would be time limited. So the lockdown starts this Thursday and it's due to end on the 2nd of December. On that date, the government have already announced that their furlough scheme will expire. That's very different to the first time they announced the furlough scheme, which was for, I think, 3 months, and then they extended it again. But there are many reasons to think this 4-week cut-off point might be little more than wishful thinking. So you can cast your mind back to March when that first lockdown was introduced, and it wasn't actually reported as a 3-month lockdown. No, let's look at a headline from the time. So here you can see Boris Johnson orders 3-week lockdown of UK to tackle coronavirus spread. So, they planned it as a 3-week lockdown. It lasted a lot longer. So the toughest phase of the lockdown was 7 weeks. Then they sort of loosened it a little bit. You could meet people outside, etc. But it wasn't until July, so 4 months later, that hospitality opened. So the idea that we are going to be able to reopen everything in December, possible. It's possible that we're going to be able to ease the restrictions then, but unless we have a functioning test and trace system by then, which means we're going to have a radically different system of doing it, a different method of doing it than this Sarkar-run national system, which is failing, then we could well be in a long lockdown and a similar situation yet again. There is some recognition about this from the government now. They've sort of rolled back a bit from Saturday. They're all saying, we might have to extend it beyond then. The bigger difference, though, and the more meaningful difference, is that this time around, schools will remain open. Schools and universities will remain open. So that decision was explained by Michael Gove in an exchange with Andrew Marr on Sunday.
Are you absolutely committed to keeping schools open whatever happens?
Yes, absolutely.
Even if the virus is progressing very fast in schools, you'll still keep them open?
Well, all the evidence suggests, and again, we will be guided by the evidence and by the emerging consensus. All the evidence suggests that schools are not a centre of infection and that schools are safe. And I was reassured again by what Sir Keir Starmer said earlier.
You say that you're going to follow the evidence. Here is the ONS survey summary older teenagers and young adults continue to have the highest positivity rates, while rates appear to be steeply increasing among secondary school children. And Neil Ferguson has said that the challenge may be that we are not able to get on top of the transmission unless we close schools.
Yes. Well,
so if that's the evidence, and you say you follow it.
Well, the key thing is, at certain points, you do have to say there are limits to the level of restriction that we are going to impose. The levels of restriction that we're imposing overall are uncomfortable. There are things that we are asking people not to do that, frankly, I hate having to say. So restrictions on, for example, worship on Sunday are deeply, deeply difficult for me to put forward. But what we've got to do is to try to recognise what the bundle of measures are, which will ensure that overall we can reduce R below 1. Now, it's perfectly possible to say if you add these measures, then you can be even more certain of reducing. And it's perfectly possible to say, I prefer to take this one or that one away.
Yes.
But a balance has to be struck. And the balance that we believe is right is continuing with education in the interests of children and also in the interests of their families. But one of the things I would say is overall, of course, you can't eliminate the spread of infection without closing down the country fully.
Completely.
So there's got to be a balance, and we believe the balance is struck right in this way.
I'm not trying to be silly. I understand these are horrible, horrible choices, but it may well be that you face a choice of closing schools and ending the lockdown relatively earlier, or extending the lockdown longer in order to keep schools open. Which way do you go?
I take your point, but we want to keep schools open.
So you would extend the lockdown and keep schools open if that's what it came to?
I don't believe it will be that case, but I do believe that we want to keep schools open, and I believe that the measures that we're putting in place will enable us to do so.
So that was a bit of a shape-shifting argument there from Michael Gove. So we started off by saying all the evidence suggests that schools are not a centre of infection and that schools are safe. Andrew Marr then sort of points out, actually, that's not remotely what the evidence points out. That's not what it shows. And then Michael Gove moves to a completely different argument, a much more reasonable argument, by the way, which is to say, yes, it is a risk, but it's potentially a risk worth taking. On that latter point, Keir Starmer seems to be in total agreement.
Schools must stay open. It's really important. The harm that children are caused by not being in schools is huge. So they must stay open, but we've got to manage the risk. What I said to the Prime Minister in September was, what you should do is elevate, if you like, children and staff and teachers to the status of NHS staff.
Yeah, okay.
And that means having mass targeted testing at schools on a weekly basis. The government didn't put any precaution around schools. If you want your schools to be open, and we should, you've got to manage that risk.
So you've been very clear about that. Let me read you what Kevin Courtney, the National Education Union official, said yesterday on television. He said it would be self-defeating for the government to impose a national lockdown whilst ignoring the role of schools as a major contributor to the spread of virus. We know the virus is going up in schools at the moment. He wants them all closed. What's your message to him?
I want schools open. I think the harm to children of being out of school
is
too high.
Circulating?
We have to manage the risk, but it is a priority to keep schools open. We need to make sure they're as safe as possible, and the government should put in place effective testing at schools. Put children, teachers and staff at the front of the queue in the same way as NHS staff to make sure that we control it.
That was a more honest answer there from Starmer than from Gove. He didn't try to pretend there was no risk. He just said this is a risk we are going to try and manage. He also had what seemed like a reasonable idea to me, this idea that we should have mass testing in schools in the same way that we have sort of priority testing for NHS hospitals. And in fact, if we went into a lockdown, it's an argument that Starmer didn't make, but I haven't seen made that often, actually. A big advantage of going into a lockdown should mean that the general population needs much less testing than they did before because we're in contact with each other much less. And then ideally, you should be able to direct that. We're told there's 500,000 daily capacity tests in the country at the moment. If you directed that all towards the schooling system, then potentially we could get somewhere. What I'm going to go to next, though, is the position of the National Education Union, because it's important to say, whilst there are these options open that the government could make to make schools a bit safer, they haven't done them yet. And on Saturday, the National Education Union released a statement calling for schools to close throughout the entire period of this lockdown and then afterwards open on a shift basis. Kevin Courtney, the General Secretary of the Union, the Joint General Secretary of the Union, justified the move by saying the following. So he said, "It is clear from ONS data that schools are an engine for virus transmission. It would be self-defeating for the government to impose a national lockdown whilst ignoring the role of schools as a major contributor to the spread of the virus." He continued, "The latest figures from the ONS estimate that 1% of primary pupils and 2% of secondary pupils have the virus, and that these levels have increased dramatically since wider opening in September. NEU analysis of ONS figures shows that virus levels are now 9 times higher among primary school pupils and an astonishing 50 times higher amongst secondary school pupils." That's compared to when schools opened in September. What does the science say about this? And I was really delighted earlier that we got to spoke to Gabriel Scally, who's President of Epidemiology and Public Health at the Royal Society of Medicine. He's also a member of Independent Sage and someone who really knows about this stuff. Independent Sage have been putting out some of the best sort of scientific analysis of this particular crisis in a sort of unbiased way. And as I say, this schools question is the one that I find most morally complicated. This is what Gabriel Scally told me about where the evidence stands at the moment on the safety of opening schools over the next 4 weeks.
Well, I think we have to start by saying that all of us on Independent Sage, we really think schools are extraordinarily important, and the education of our children and the socialisation extremely important. And we have been very protective of schools all the way through, and we think the government should have been even more protective and done a lot in the last 6 months to make sure schools could remain open. At the moment, when you look at the position we are with the virus in England and the measures that have been proposed at the moment, they will bring the virus down, but it will be a slow process. There is no doubt about it that closing all schools would reduce that time and reduce it markedly, but that has to be weighed against the benefits to children and young people. There appears to us to be a significant problem in the secondary schools in particular in terms of the spread of the virus, and perhaps we should be concentrating there. But it's not an issue on which we have reached a firm conclusion. We're waiting to see what the government is proposing, if anything, in response to the concerns that have been expressed, particularly by teachers and staff of schools. And also this issue, which they may not have looked at, about the length of time it's going to take to get the virus down as long as schools remain open.
So Gabriel Scally, they're kind of, I suppose, expressing much of the uncertainty that many of us feel about this, even with, a wealth of scientific experience and scientific knowledge. There's still a huge amount of uncertainty here. I want to bring up a few sort of slides, actually, from that government presentation on Saturday to sort of show how implausible, in a way, it seems that schools would not be a major site of infection because of sort of how the dates match up. So we can get up, it's graphic 8A, Fox, which is about the R rate over time. And so as you can see, throughout the summer, throughout June, July and August, it was pretty much below 1 the whole time. Towards the end of August, or actually from the beginning of August, that's probably eat out to help out. It sort of increases a little bit. I'd say that's that. Time-wise, that looks like eat out to help out. But then it's only once you get to September and schools and universities open that it rockets, right up there, way above 1. And the idea that could be anything other than schools and universities doesn't seem that convincing to me. You can see the effect of that R rate on the total numbers in the ONS statistics. So again, you can see here, basically cases pretty low all the way to the start of September, then they just massively go up. Also, in terms of who it is that's catching this, the data that Kevin Courtney references is from the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, which shows the different age groups have been affected by coronavirus. What it shows you is that since schools opened, it is years 7 to 11 and years 12 to age 24 who have increased the most. And this is since schools opened, so it's kind of implausible to suggest that it's not related to their opening. I sort of pushed Gabriel on this issue a little bit about, how much has the opening of schools pushed the epidemic forward?
One of the things that there's a tremendous tendency to do is try to identify the one thing that's really crucially important or the one thing that's going to solve the problem. And all of these things act together. It's not just any one thing predominating. What is clear is that the summer wasn't well spent, and when people went back to school, they went back to schools that in many cases were remarkably unchanged. Independence Age have been arguing during the summer that we needed to really change our notion of what schools meant. We needed to be investing in expanding their premises, putting up temporary buildings, taking over other buildings that weren't being used, perhaps in the hospitality industry, putting up, for example, marquees in school grounds or in other grounds that are not being used at the moment. All of that, plus engineering work in schools to make sure that there was proper ventilation. The role of airflow is extraordinarily important and doesn't seem to be properly dealt with. So I think they have been neglected. I think as a result of that, we have seen a lot of spread in younger age groups. Given the age categories, it's difficult sometimes to differentiate between those in the higher end of the 15 plus still at school, and then the undergraduates who, of course, came together in September, towards the end of September. And there were undoubtedly extremely concerning and large outbreaks in the universities. And I think if anyone was to blame for that, I think the universities, because they seem to us to get confused in their role as educational institutions. And in many towns and cities, they are the largest landlord. And that landlord role seemed to us to be unhealthily in conflict with what was really in the best interests of both students and those university towns and cities, their communities.
And finally, obviously, the National Education Union, their biggest, their first responsibility is to teachers, their members. So I asked Gabriel about how leaving schools open during this phase of the lockdown could affect the health of teaching staff.
Well, the risk will be declining now that action has been taken outside schools. So the risk has probably been maximal in the last week and will start to go down towards the end of next week. But the risk largely depends on the arrangements for the teaching. Depends on how well the school is segregating children into different groups, year groups, class groups, how well they're dealing with the issue of ventilation and social distancing, how much time they're spending out of doors, how much use they're making of other buildings rather than compact and airless classrooms. All of those issues are extremely important if schools are going to continue to operate.
That was Gabriel Scally of Independent Sage. Again, still, it's such a complex issue. I'm going to make sure we get someone from the Education Union on later in the week to get the sort of teacher's perspective of this. I mean, what's clear from that is how silly and how ridiculous, really, it was to open schools at the same time as opening everything else. Because, as Gabriel Scally said there, it's a sort of point that I haven't heard mentioned that much, is that actually the more pubs and bars are open, the more teachers are at threat, because the more community spread is, the more there's going to be coronavirus in schools. So actually, if you've got a lockdown everywhere other than a school, teachers aren't particularly safe there, but they're safer than they would be if there weren't a lockdown. Again, also all the missed opportunities that this government have not taken to make schools safe, so we wouldn't have to have this incredibly morally tortuous debate about whether or not to close them. Ash, I want to go to your thoughts on the role of education and the different policies that the government have adopted this time around.
I just wanted to talk about universities specifically because in my spare time, I'm a lecturer. I work in a university in Amsterdam, and that's actually probably where I got coronavirus. So I went for a week to go and teach, and we followed the rules to the letter. The school had implemented coronavirus policies. We split the cohort into two, so you could have smaller seminar groups. Everyone was sat 1.5 meters away, but we were really limited by the architecture of the space. So many universities have got windows that you can't open fully, and we were no different. That kind of window which you can only open for a crack. So even though we were socially distanced, you had really limited airflow ventilation. The sequencing of who got sick and when, it's likely that one student had coronavirus, came into the seminar, and then myself and another student got it. And it's not that student's fault. And I wouldn't even say, the university were to blame. They were following Dutch government guidance, which was very similar to British government guidance. But what that demonstrated to me was that to for all our best intentions, and we all are motivated by good intentions, I really missed face-to-face teaching. There are certain things that you can only get from face-to-face teaching, where students had really missed it too. We really wanted to have some kind of normalcy return to education. Is that by trying to restore face-to-face teaching in a context of rising infections, we actually ended up disrupting students' learning far more than had we stuck to remote learning. Because then what happened is that I'm off sick, so I missed 2 weeks of work. 2 other students are sick. We don't know how many others were asymptomatic. Half the cohort has to self-isolate because of exposure, and also because students do have a social life outside of seminars. And you end up with a situation where you are set back weeks in terms of being able to progress through the course, simply because you try to do this thing out of good intentions, but quite frankly, within this context, it's not safe to do. And so then you've got 2 things that I think you've got to think about in terms of policy making terms. One is, does an educational policy exist where you can have face-to-face teaching at all, and you're not making sacrifices in other areas of public life, whether that's hospitality, leisure, office work, so on and so forth, right? Is that possible? And I think part of the answer that we've gotten is no. And then the other thing is, what kind of mitigating factors are you going to introduce to deal with that disruption and discontinuity of learning? Now, that's not so bad for university students or the age group that I'm teaching. It is particularly bad for primary school students and the earlier years of secondary school, right? That's where you really do see students having this massive impact, on their development because of the interruption of face-to-face learning. And the things that could be done to deal with that, for instance, having more availability of laptops, ensuring that deprived households have internet connectivity. These are areas where the government is just flopping because, they're trying to do this on the cheap. If you want students to have some kind of continuity of learning, while schools aren't in session, you could have free school meals being made available to deprived households through the holidays. That's not been happening. Everywhere you turn, you see corners being cut by this government. And that then compounds the problems which are decades old in terms of, poorer students having to live in overcrowded accommodation, not having the same access to resources or educational facilities as richer students. And you see in a lockdown, that's how those inequalities get entrenched. I don't think that the response to that is a kind of, Nigel Farage, no lockdown for anybody response, because again, a thing that's disrupting to education is, your parents or your grandparents dying of coronavirus. But I don't think that governments across Europe, and I don't think it's something which is unique to Britain, have dealt with either the realities of the limitations on teaching because of coronavirus, or have invested enough money in dealing with those limitations in education and dealing with the fact that so many students are being left behind.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of universities who have managed to sort of reopen without the costs. And that's because they mass test every student every week. These are some of the richer ones in the United States. I think Duke University is one of them. Obviously, secondary schools and most universities in this country don't have huge labs where they can do their own testing. That's what Duke University are doing. Although what they do is they pool the tests. So they put all of the swabs in the same, not all of the swabs, but you put all of the swabs from one class in the same bucket. And then if they all test negative, the whole class is negative. Makes a lot of sense to me. Anyway, let's go on to one other area where this round of lockdown is going to be somewhat different to the last, very different to the last, in fact, which is that there is now an organised anti-lockdown movement. Before we go on to that, some super chats. Francisco, or I don't know how I pronounce that with the X, with a $5. Matt J with a $5. Chris Day with 20 quid. Thank you very much. JW tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. The argument around schools should not be one of schools completely closing or staying open. We need an innovative approach to education. It doesn't need to be 30 students crammed into a poorly ventilated classroom. I think that was the Education Union's position back in September, and I suppose what their position is to say, look, we offered these innovative solutions, the government didn't put them forward, which is why now we're taking the nuclear option. Stephanie tweets, on the hashtag Tysky Sour. Universities are in many cities the largest landlords. They have vested interest in more than just their students' education. Hashtag Tysky Sour. True. I mean, although I think to be fair to them, it's, they're also making difficult financial choices as well. Although, the move to encourage all of their students back to halls to catch coronavirus was definitely an unforgivable one. Anyway, next story. Nigel Farage has had a busy year, far from resting on his laurels once the Tories adopted his core policy of taking the United Kingdom into a hard Brexit. The 56-year-old has spent lockdown touring beaches and hotels, haranguing migrants and delivering sycophantic stump speeches for Donald Trump. He's now back in the UK to launch a new party. Him and Richard Tice have applied to change the name of the Brexit Party to Reform UK. Not a very good name. Its principal aim will be to end coronavirus lockdowns. Nigel Farage explained the motivation for launching this new party in a Twitter video yesterday.
I'm here in Washington, D.C. We're 2 days away from a presidential election. It's now being completely dominated by the COVID-19 crisis. But here's the interesting point. Joe Biden very much takes the line there's going to be a long, dark winter coming, and that America needs to lock down further. That's his pitch to the American people. They'll be safer under him. Trump takes the completely opposite view. He says that lockdown leads to economic disaster, leads to mass depression, and leads to vast numbers of people losing their jobs, their security, and their general sense of well-being. He says the vulnerable can protect themselves, the rest of us have to learn to live with it. But I tell you what's interesting, at least in America they've got a choice. At least in America they're having a debate, because we are locking down from Wednesday. This has been decreed by Boris Johnson. Guess what? Sir Keir Starmer 100% agrees, as do all the other political parties represented in Westminster. There has to be a vote before this happens. Oh, sure, there'll be a few backbench Tory MPs that will rebel. The rest of them, they get bought off, they get bribed, they'll get blackmailed. So we are heading for lockdown, and there's a growing number of us in the country can see that what lockdown means, even in health terms, is disastrous. I was talking just 2 days ago to a charity in Kent, a diabetes charity in Kent. They've got 100,000 patients that they're looking after. Not a single one of them has been screened since March. So, goodness knows what that means for amputations, for blindness, and that's just diabetes. Lung cancer diagnoses are down 75%, and the figures for chronic heart condition are not far behind that.
It's very telling that his argument was basically Trump's doing this, so I'm going to do it too. It barely seems like he even believes what he's saying. And you'd have to be an idiot to believe what he's saying, because nothing he said was coherent there. So the idea that you will make people with diabetes and cancer get quicker treatment if you let coronavirus run wild through the population is for the birds. It doesn't make any sense, right? So the reason we are having a lockdown now is to reduce capacity, reduce pressure, on the NHS so that it still retains capacity to treat other infections. If we let coronavirus run riot around the economy, the society, the only way you could have hospitals still doing cancer treatments, diabetes treatments, is if we had a blanket policy that if you catch coronavirus, you should just stay at home, and if you die, you die, whatever age. Because, you would have lots of people in their 60s going into ICU if we just let this run riot throughout the economy. Their suggestion, their alternative to lockdown is equally incoherent. So we're going to go to a quote from their article in The Telegraph. So by there, I'm saying Nigel Farage and Richard Tice. He is the chairman of the Brexit Party, which is now to become Reform UK. So they write, focused protection is the key, targeting resources at those most at risk, the elderly, vulnerable, or those with other medical conditions. Many of them would prefer to hug their grandchildren and enjoy a family Christmas. They should not be criminalised for the simple acts that make life worth living, particularly in their final years. The rest of the population should, with good hygiene measures and a dose of common sense, get on with life. This way we build immunity in the population. The young act as warriors, creating a shield of protection. Multi-generational households will, of course, need to implement stricter measures. Now, the reason that's so incoherent, even not like internally incoherent, is he's saying, one, we should protect the elderly, separate them from the rest of the population, and let young people catch coronavirus to build up some level of herd immunity. Now, it works in theory, it doesn't work in practice, as we've seen everywhere in the world. When young people get coronavirus, old people get it as well. But they've actually built into their example that old people will get to hug their grandchildren at Christmas. Now, that's the precise opposite of what happens if you take the strategy he's suggesting. He's suggesting you make, the whole society a sort of hotbed of coronavirus and then completely separate the elderly from them, the elderly or people with long-term health conditions that make them especially vulnerable. If you adopt this particular policy that Nigel Farage is proposing, the last thing old people are going to be able to do is hug their grandchildren at Christmas. It's just incoherent. It's ill-educated, incoherent. Ash, I want to go to you, I suppose, partly on what they are proposing, but also the political implications of this. Presumably, Nigel Farage is, he's not expecting to get elected or enter government on this particular anti-lockdown proposal, but he does have quite a strong pedigree in terms of pulling the Conservatives to the right and pressuring them to take positions which they otherwise would not have done. He's obviously trying to empower that section of backbench Tory MPs who have sort of drank the Kool-Aid when it comes to anti-lockdown dogma.
I mean, so in terms of the internal incoherence of what Nigel Farage was spelling out in terms of his vision of a pandemic management strategy, I don't think any of us should be surprised that Nigel Farage is epidemiologically incoherent. Okay, and that's not what he's trying to do. It doesn't make any sense. You're completely right. But essentially what he's trying to tell his base is that you are justified in resisting any attempt to rope you into this language of collective responsibility. That is not something you have to do. We can get through a pandemic, which is essentially a phenomena of social contact, without you having to change any one of your behaviors. Right, that's what he's trying to say, is that changed behaviors are for these elderly, these disabled, these vulnerable, but then also turning to his very elderly audience and going, but you don't have to change your behavior either. So what it's articulating is a worldview, and it's a distinctly, hyper neoliberal one. It imagines that we are all these atomized creatures who don't exist within a context of shared obligations and responsibilities to one another. That's what's being said. And it's a fantasy world. It's a complete fantasy world. It doesn't line up internally, and it doesn't line up with the science either. Because even if you have this idea of young people going out and catching coronavirus to their heart's content, we know that long COVID affects a sizable minority of young people. We don't know what all of those long-term effects are. It has had an impact on people's, heart function, on their lung capacity, and all of these other things. So we don't know that it's just 2 weeks of feeling ropey and that's it for most people. There's going to be some really nasty long-term effects of this. As for the political positioning of it, I think that there are two ways in which you can look at this. One is Nigel Farage looking for a kind of political purpose after Brexit. So even if he's not able to generate the same kind of political momentum as he was able to with Brexit, it's still list building, it's still profile building, it's still data gathering, and that's useful for a political project. I would also say that that's the kind of lowest expectation, and that's still good for him. The highest expectation, and perhaps the aim, is that his modus operandi is taking these issues which are, marginal amongst the electorate. Lockdown skepticism is a marginal point of view in the electorate, much like Euroscepticism was, and polarizing on it. And that's because he's able to mobilize that one section of society where this is no marginal point of view, and that is the conservative grassroots. So you have a conservative grassroots, which was at odds with the rest of the population on the issue of Europe, and that was the hammer which could reshape the Conservative Parliamentary Party within Nigel Farage's own image. That was something that he was able to do over a long period of time, very many years. And I think that it's questionable whether he'll be as effective within such a short period of time. I do think that we have to be wary, though, of the political manifestations of lockdown skepticism. There is generally a consensus between the government and the opposition on lockdowns being an effective way to handle the pandemic. And I think that the one thing that the left needs to be wary of is that it insists on lockdown as the only pandemic management strategy outside of all these other things which can contribute to suppression of the the virus. And that would include really strict testing in terms of incoming international travellers, testing of temperatures in public spaces, having a very different kind of quarantine strategy. There are all these other things that can be done. And I think that it's a mistake for the left to solely identify itself with lockdown, whereas really any lockdown after the first one is itself an admission of policy failure.
No, I mean, that's exactly right, because it's not necessarily that they are just anti-lockdown, because you could also say that the zero COVID people. So this was somewhat put forward by the independent SAGE guys. They were saying we can have a really strict lockdown for 3 weeks, then introduce a really effective test and trace system. And that also means we can avoid a lockdown, a bit like what they've managed in New Zealand or the East Asian countries. But these guys are saying, no, we shouldn't really bother with test and trace. All we should do is just let the virus run riot and have herd immunity. And if some old people die, so be it. Or the other issue, as you say, Ash, is that even if long COVID is a relatively rare response, if everyone gets the disease, then that still adds up to a hell of a lot of people. We're going to go to America now. Before we do, we have a couple of super chats. Mickey Mouse with a $5. You guys are an inspiration. Keep up the great work. That's very kind of you, Mickey Mouse. Thank you for the donation. As ever, we love the super chats. This organisation, this show is completely funded by your donations. If you want to help us grow, if you want to help us build this project, introduce new shows, keep building up the tech, then please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. It means the world to us. And now more than ever, we are desperate to build a big, sustainable left-wing institution that can hold ground, because there are lots of people trying to destroy us at the moment. I don't mean us personally, but the left in general. Right. We are less than, I'm 24 hours away from the election that will decide whether Donald Trump will spend 4 more years as US president. The polls seem to suggest he won't. Biden has a consistent national lead of around 8 points. But as ever in the US system, who wins will come down to a few 100,000 voters in select swing states. This year, none is more important than Pennsylvania, where a surprise Trump win in 2016, along with neighboring Michigan and Wisconsin, deprived Clinton of the presidency. Trump is way behind in those latter 2 states this time around, so Michigan and Wisconsin. But Pennsylvania is quite a lot closer. This is a good graphic from the FT on polling in the states Trump would need to win the White House. So you can see here the argument they're making, which people at 538, everyone seems to be fairly confident about, is that Trump to win would have to win all of these states. He won all of them in 2016. He'd have to win them again. And as you can see there, the only place where Trump is currently leading among that group is Texas. But then in Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona, he's losing by almost the margin of error. And it's in Pennsylvania where he needs to mount a bit of a surprise overturning of Biden's lead. And the significance of this is emphasized, really, is proven by how much both candidates are campaigning in that particular district. So you can now see Trump, who on Saturday was speaking at 4 separate rallies. Here he is speaking in Montesville.
Under Biden, there will be no school, no graduations, no weddings, no Thanksgivings, no Easters, no Christmases, and no 4th of July. Other than that, you're going to have a wonderful life. Now think of this guy, ruin American youth.
That was Donald Trump there, saying what a Biden lockdown would mean for Thanksgiving. Biden was also in the state on Sunday. Here he is in Philadelphia.
When Americans vote, America will be heard. When America's heard, I believe the message is going to be loud and clear. It's time for Donald Trump to pack his bags and go home. It's time to breathe some life back into this nation. We're done. We're tired of the tweets, the anger, the hate, the failure, the irresponsibility. We've got a lot of work to do. If I'm elected your president, we're going to do it, and we're going to act, and we're going to start from the very first day.
I'm going to be joined in one moment by Sarah Jaffe, author, Labour journalist, and friend of the show, who is in Pennsylvania, very luckily for us in Philadelphia. I think for the moment, though, we're having a few problems with a microphone. So what I'm going to do before we speak is I'm going to rush through some of the other clips that I'd prepared, which sort of really sort of set out what is at stake currently in Pennsylvania. So in terms of 2016, what seems to be different this time around is whilst in 2016, the shock, why it went to Trump instead of Hillary Clinton when she was expecting to win that state hands down, it's gone Democrat every presidential election since 1992, is that white working class voters who traditionally voted Democrat in the state swung to Donald Trump. The suggestion is Biden can appeal to some of those voters better than Hillary Clinton did. He doesn't have the association with Bill Clinton that she did. He's also a bit less dismissive of people in general. The other explanation as to why Biden is polling better than Clinton was and why he's more likely to take the state is that suburban women are swinging away from the Republicans. So white women who sort of ended up basically voting Republican as usual in the 2016 general election are now seeming to swing away from the Democrats. We can see Obama now. So he was sent out to neighboring Michigan on the weekend, and he's making an argument which Democratic strategists are hoping will appeal to these suburban women.
And here's another thing, with Joe and Kamala at the helm, this is a big benefit. Michelle and I were talking about this over dinner the other day. You're not going to have to think about them every day. You're not going to have to argue with your family about them every day. It won't be so exhausting. You'll be able to get on with your lives knowing that the president is not going to suggest we inject bleach as a possible cure of COVID. You won't have to find out. You won't wake up in the morning and kind of open your phone. Oh, newsflash. The president retweeted conspiracy theories that the Navy SEALs didn't actually kill bin Laden.
So you can see why the Democrats are going for that. It's a fairly safe argument that you won't have a president who's a complete idiot, who you have to sort of wake up in the morning and see what have they said now and sort of cringe. You'll have someone who might not be particularly inspiring, but at least you don't have to worry that he's going to blow something up, at least not in America. I mean, we know that centrist Democrats have a habit of blowing stuff up elsewhere. I want to show you now, though, Trump's bid to win back suburban women, and sort of in traditional Trump style, it's not particularly subtle.
So can I ask you to do me a favor? Suburban women, will you please like me? Remember? Please. Please. I saved your damn neighborhood, okay? The other thing, I don't have that much time to be that nice. I can do it, but I gotta go quickly. We don't have time. They want me to be politically correct. Oh, yes, let's discuss it. Let's talk about it over the next 10 years. No. Now, we saved suburbia in the U.S. I got rid of a regulation that was a disaster, and it was very unfair, and you've been reading about it for a long time. It's been going on for a long time. It became much worse under Obama and Biden. Okay? And I think we're going to see that the women really like Trump a lot. That happened last time, remember? Remember 4 years ago? 4 years ago, they said, women will never vote for him. I said, why am I so bad? They say the women will never vote. Then I got 52%. They said, what the hell happened with the women? Except this time, see, this is much easier. You damn well better vote for me, Pennsylvania. You better.
You can see the number of differences between the Biden rallies and the Trump rallies. Biden, he has people who are in the cars honking the horns. They're all socially distanced. In Trump rallies, they're all very close to each other. It doesn't look particularly COVID secure. But I kind of love that line of just like, suburban women, will you please like me? It's bizarre. You might as well say, swing voters in this state, can you please vote for me? Sarah, we're going to try your line. Sarah Jaffe, Labour journalist, friend of the show. How are you doing?
Hello.
Oh, you are a little bit frozen.
I look frozen. So in a terrifying little Airbnb, it looks like a jail cell. I'm just sitting in front of the window.
So tell us very briefly. Maybe I'm going to go to Ash. If we can't get it to work today, we'll come back on Wednesday. Although, no, start telling me. Sorry. What's the situation in Pennsylvania? Is this all about suburban white women?
No. So it's not about suburban white women. That's not who's going to decide this election. That's the thing. The people who, well, I mean, I guess they'll maybe vote for Trump, but the people who are actually going to decide this election are Black voters in Philadelphia. That's actually the swing community in this state and always has been. And so there's like so little attention paid to it. And it drives me a little insane. Like there's a billboard in Philly with a big white guy on it saying, "I'm a lifelong conservative and I'm voting for Biden." And like the utter contempt for the people who actually live here is, I've just kind of had enough of it. There are also Humvees on the street. So that's, also a thing right now. We're under curfew again. I think I was under curfew in Philly the last time I was on. So the more things change, the more they stay the same.
You know what? Your connection is now perfect. So I'm very glad we kept you. On that issue of especially Black voters in Philadelphia and this question of who's going to bother to turn out, I want to show you a clip that we showed before, which was the wrong one, but it's the right one now. So this is video 9, Fox, which is Donald Trump sort of talking about who should and shouldn't vote and when and how.
I'm not just running against Joe Biden. I'm running against the left-wing media, the big tech giants, the rhinos. You know what a rhino is, right? Republican in name only. We got a couple of them. There aren't too many of them left. They're on respirators, actually. And the Washington swamp, which is much deeper and much more vicious than we ever thought even possible. On Tuesday, November 3rd, now, maybe you do it sooner, but I think this group wants November 3rd. It's called Election Day. Of course, now that our United States Supreme Court has delayed everything, it's going to be a very interesting evening. And I wonder what happens during that period of delay with the ballots. I wonder what happens. Are they going to mysteriously find more ballots, Mr. Congressman? Are they going to find more ballots? Can you imagine what happened? Can you imagine? Just be very careful, be vigilant, and watch, and report whatever you see. Because, this state, we love it. Went to school here, right? Went to college. We love it. But strange things have been known to happen, especially in Philadelphia.
So they're saying strange things have been known to happen, especially in Philadelphia. I mean, Sarah, he's clearly there trying to sort of put into doubt however the vote goes in Philadelphia, presumably because that's where the Black people who vote Democrat are. How big a deal is Trump's sort of attempt to disenfranchise people and stir doubt about the results going to matter tomorrow?
So I think, Trump stirring doubt about the results is probably going to matter in terms of like what the more violent of his supporters who have a lot of guns do, which like it doesn't make me feel good about being a person who's going to be like out on the streets trying to report on this stuff tomorrow. But the thing is that like voter suppression is old in this country, right? And voter suppression of Black people in particular is really old. They're actually quite good at it. The Supreme Court that he's talking about, in fact, Trump's Supreme Court, now that he's got 3 justices on it, invalidated the Voting Rights Act a few years ago, which was designed to make sure that Black people could maybe access the franchise in this country. And so what I'm worried about is all over the country that all of the various ways that Black people's voting rights have been infringed are going to continue to happen. And the thing that we're seeing a lot of, that I think I sent you a bunch of articles about this morning because I have a lot of feelings about it, is the way that the police are, the police have always been Trump's, and I've written about that and talked about that. And we're seeing more and more how emboldened they are to be very about that. Even in places like Philadelphia and New York, where there are, stories about cops yelling Trump out the window at protesters. Unions, the Philadelphia Police Union in particular, long history of, among other things, devoting itself to trying to get Mumia executed. They're partisan actors, right? These unions, I joke about them operating more like the mafia than like a labor union. And in this particular case, Trump is calling for the police to incite. You are people who've been involved in protests lately, and you go to vote, and there's a bunch of cops at your polling site, and they're already doing snatch and grabs of activists here. What is that going to do to voter turnout? what does it do to voter turnout to have the city under 9 p.m. curfew, which I don't know if it's going to be lifted tomorrow night. We, in the spring, were getting notification of curfew about 15 minutes after it was supposedly going into effect. Things that I don't know about that I'm legitimately kind of worried about right now.
And I mean, on a practical level, I mean, how likely are we to know the result in Pennsylvania on Wednesday? Could it be the case? Because I read an article in the New Yorker, very interesting, saying we might not know the results for months. I suppose in a similar way to George W. Bush versus Al Gore, but now with the new element of loads and loads of mail-in ballots, which are actually allowed to arrive, 3 days after the election. Or I mean, it does seem, as well as the fact that you have this sort of anti-democratic, incredibly cynical president who will use any means whatever to try and overturn democracy, you do also have quite a practically difficult situation, whoever was in charge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, the long-standing American habit of calling the election on elections has been terrible, again, for as long as it's been a thing that we do. It's a bad idea. You shouldn't do it. And the problems predate, again, the 2000 election, although that was the first presidential election I could vote in. And so I've been traumatized for life by it. And then I also remember being here in Philly in 2004 when we also didn't know the results on election night because of Ohio in that case. And I remember sort of stumbling around, having gotten 2 hours of sleep, trying to find breakfast and trying to figure out if the Democrats were going to fight any harder in 2004 than they did in 2000. The answer to that was no. So yeah, the question of what happens when we don't know. Trump is almost certainly going to declare victory if it is not immediately obvious that he has lost. Pete Buttigieg style, right? From Iowa. Oh, God.
Yeah.
In fact, Navarra's own Dalia Gabrielle was joking to me the other day that, it's just going to be Iowa, but forever. And not necessarily wrong. That could really happen, and we might never actually know the real results. I'm laughing. It's terrifying. But it's also just this country is such a shambles right now. I was going to my storage unit this morning because I just got back from being in London for 4 months, and parked outside of I don't even know what kind of store it was. I think appliances or something. And it was boarded up. Somebody had taken a piece of the metal gate that you pull down over it when it closes at night, stuck that through the boards, and somebody had written on it, "Already looted, nothing left." And that's Philadelphia today.
Yeah, wow. Sarah Jaffe.
We're just this is America.
Yeah. It sounds wow. I'm excited to see what happens. It's a very interesting political phenomenon. We will have to let you go now. You can do your own poll watching. I don't know. Are people doing that on the left? Is there sort of Trump sending out his people with guns, and then you've got the left out there sort of saying with their smartphones? I don't know. Anyway, we'll keep speaking to you because I'm desperate to know what happens in Pennsylvania over the next 48 hours. But for now, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks.
That was Sarah Jaffe speaking to us live from Pennsylvania with a connection that was going in and out. It was leaving me on tenterhooks. We are going to go to our final story. Before we do that, we've got 2,600 people watching, 837 likes. Let's get it up to, well, I mean, we can easily hit 1,000 before we end the show, but let's see how high it can go. Let's go straight on to the final story. We weren't going to talk about the Labour anti-Semitism row on today's show, but there was an article in the Sunday Times I do think it is worth talking about. It was a profile by Rosamund Irwin of the ex-Labour MP Luciana Berger. So the article started by recounting some of the awful online abuse Berger has been subjected to. We can go to a section in the piece. So it says, the former MP of Liverpool, Wavertree, who had joined the party as a student and was in effect hounded out of it by anti-Semitism, received a message online threatening that she would pay for the suspension of the former leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Now, look, while my politics and Luciana Berger's is completely different, one thing that's undeniable is that she has been subjected to lots of abuse, lots of awful abuse, some of it from the right, some of it from the left, and you should not be, I'm sure our audience aren't, but no one should be saying that an MP is going to pay for the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn. Clearly very threatening language. The next line from the piece is interesting, though. because it concerns us. Let's go to this. So it says, during a live chat session run by the Corbyn sympathising Navarra media, anonymous commentators dubbed her a vile fifth columnist and the face of evil. Now, much like those first comments that I showed you, these again are completely unacceptable. You shouldn't be referring to Jewish people as part of a fifth column. Clearly, sort of talking about dual loyalties, and it's not good. It makes people uncomfortable, and it does for a reason, because it's very adjacent to sort of far right anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Not good. Obviously, we do our best to block these kind of comments when they do appear under our videos. We have moderators, many of you volunteers. Thank you so much for the work you do. But I have a few problems with the way this has been reported. So yes, they showed us a screenshot. Those messages did appear under our video, but we don't have a live chat session. This isn't a live chat session. That's what Rosamund Irwin called it. She's apparently the media and technology correspondent for the Times, and she thinks that Tysky Sour is a live chat session. She clearly didn't watch it, otherwise she would know that this is a program, a broadcast with a live chat box. And by the way, I love 99% of the chats you put in that live chat box. I don't want you to be tarred by these two comments that have been pointed out here. Further, we had an audience of 7,000 live viewers that night, and these two comments are somehow meant to imply that all of our audience is anti-Semitic. You might say, oh, that's a bit of a reach. She hasn't said that there. What she's just said is that this is where these comments appeared against Luciana Berger, apologies. But again, why is it Navarra that it has appeared? Why is it Navarra and not LBC, not Talk Radio? If you have seen any live stream on this channel, on this platform, on YouTube, there are always going to be hundreds of comments every second. And I'll tell you, if you look at LBC, if you look at Talk Radio, they're a hell of a lot worse than us, because I'm very defensive about our Tysky Sour audience. Most of you, progressive, anti-racists, brilliant people, which is not what you can say always under not what you could say under a Nigel Farage LBC live stream. But Rosamund Irwin doesn't seem to understand this. She doesn't know this. She's blaming us for comments on a live stream. Now, I pointed this out to Rosamund Irwin because I thought it was rather unfair for Navarra to appear in this article. It's clear the implication she was trying to make. This was her response to me on Twitter. So she said, except those weren't the only two, were they? And I'm sure you know that. We don't allow comments like that on our site. What do you do to stop anti-Semitic abuse? Now, from this very polite exchange I had with Rosamund Irwin, I was never abusive. I was just saying, I think the way you've represented a show I hosted in your newspaper was not very fair. She's blocked me. So I can't speak directly to her on Twitter. But if you are watching, Rosamund, I'm sure you weren't watching that previous show and you just got a screenshot sent to you by someone who hates Navarra media. But anyway, if you are watching, this is what we do. So as you've said, we don't have comments on our website. I mean, if we did, we'd have to have a different policy there. This is all on YouTube. But even on YouTube, unlike, say, LBC, we don't leave live comments up after the stream. That's because it is too hard to moderate. Basically, there are too many of them. And also, we do try and moderate our posts, which, again, is way more than LBC and Talk Radio do, which you've never included in your articles because you have no interest in casting them as associated with racism in the same way that you do crowd-funded organisations on the progressive left. Why is that? You can make your own decision. To prove the point, because, to show how common it is for unpleasant, unsavoury comments to appear on any live stream that she hasn't decided to write about, I looked at an LBC stream, and it was just a randomly selected one. It was the most recent one that day, hosted by Tom Swarbrick, kind of a centrist analyst, apologies. He used to work for Theresa May, so it's not like their most far-right show. And these are what I found. So this is just from that morning on YouTube on LBC. And again, I suppose I should give you sort of a content warning. There's going to be quite a lot of racism in these, all quite unpleasant stuff. So this is all from LBC yesterday morning. Patriotic Alternative have a longer report on their website, so telling people go search this far-right group about some sort of trumped-up terrorist attack, I think. Then we've got, your government is implementing the clergy plan on behalf of the government overlords in occupied Palestine. Now, I don't know what that plan is supposed to be, but this is clearly a very deep rabbit hole, deeply anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Then you've got Swamp So obviously, yeah, Kalergi plan is a far-right conspiracy theory. I didn't need to tell you that, but yeah, it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Then we've got swamp armies all in place as Europe locked down. Coincidence? All timed to USA election, which they get the go signal. This idea of the go signal is like real. This is deep far-right conspiracy. And then you've got someone saying, "Okay, Jew." It's not even. That's just he's just being out and out very explicit there. Now, when I showed this to Rosamund Owen, she said, "This is a odd argument. That LBC attracts racist comments doesn't make it any better that yours did too. And who would I be interviewing to use the comments you point out? What you're writing doesn't even make any sense." Now, granted, she was writing a piece about Luciana Berger. If she was writing one about anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, maybe she'd go to those sites. But that's not really what her first reply to me suggested. And again, I'm not an idiot. I know why the Sunday Times are including Novara media in an article about Labour anti-Semitism, because they want to tar us with that brush. They want to associate us with racism. That's what they do. And again, the problem here is that she doesn't have a leg to stand on. And the reason she doesn't have a leg to stand on, again, you could guess this. She works for a Murdoch paper, one, but also the comments on videos on the Sunday Times channels are not very pleasant. Right, and I want to, before going to this, I want to remind you of what she said. So her first reply to me saying, "I think this is a bit unfair. You've included our channel and my show in this way in the Sunday paper," which goes out to hundreds of thousands of people. So she wrote in response to that, "Except those weren't the only two, were they? And I'm sure you know that. We don't allow comments like that on our site." Now, let's go to a video which is on the Sunday Times YouTube site. So it's about Black Lives Matter. If you look at the content, she's sort of critiquing Black Lives Matter. Now, under that video in the comments, you can see, here we go. "Indigenous British lives matter. For 70 years, we have tolerated the destruction of our homeland and attacks on our people. No more. Tolerance is over. Mass repatriation or war." Now, that's really grim stuff. She said, "We don't allow comments like that on our site." Well, you were judging us for comments which are on our YouTube, and those are comments which are on your YouTube, so you do not have a leg to stand on. Let's get up another one. And again, I'm sorry I'm showing you all of this racism, but this is just to point out the hypocrisy of this Sunday Times journalist. So this is also under that same Sunday Times video. So it's Jeff T writes, "The trouble with the black and ethnic communities is they have a bloody big chip on their shoulders. They need to realise they are the minority in a white country and always will be. The sooner they conform to the British way of life and culture, the sooner they will be accepted as equals. The only thing they are doing is making a rod for their own backs and will continue." I don't even want to read the whole of it. Really horrible, far-right drivel. And that has been on the Sunday Times YouTube site for 4 months. Now, the comments which she decided to include in her profile to the hundreds of thousands of people who buy the Sunday Times had stayed on our site for, I think, like an hour. And this has been on her YouTube channel, or the Sunday Times YouTube channel, for 4 months. And we can also look at a few more comments that have appeared not in the YouTube channel, which, even though she's tech and media correspondent, she doesn't seem to understand that there is a distinction between someone's website and someone's YouTube channel. But these are on the website. These are on the website proper. So a few of them. "Islamophobia is a fiction to shut down debate. Legitimate criticism of Muslim teaching can't be compared to anti-Semitic demonization and lies. I'm identifying as a young black trans Chihuahua, and the truth can go whistle." Now, I mean, from reading the tweet that Rosamund Owen sent me, I'd have thought those would have been deleted from the Times website if you had any kind of half-decent moderation. But no, instead of these comments being deleted by a moderator, they were made into headlines, because this is what the Sunday Times pays their authors to write. Okay? So what you're seeing here is a situation which we have seen again and again and again in this country over the last 4 years, which is you've got people who work for a deeply structurally racist organization who literally hire people to write headlines saying Islamophobia doesn't exist. Rod Liddell is hired by the Sunday Times in The Spectator, his other outlet. He has said that there isn't enough Islamophobia in the Conservative Party. They are using the flimsiest evidence, 2 comments in a live feed where you've got hundreds of comments a minute to suggest that a left-wing channel anti-racist channel watched by, and again, I think this is a really important point, because what people try and do is they try and use two comments to tar a whole brush. And I'm just not saying we can't take responsibility for our audience. I'm saying our audience is brilliant, right? There are thousands of you, and you're really brilliant people. There are a couple of people who write dumb shit. We block them from the site if they do that, especially if it's racist. We 100% make sure they can't comment again. But the idea that this should tar our whole audience, I hate it, and especially from someone who basically works in a racism factory. You know, in the building where the Times is, you've also got Talk Radio, you've also got The Sun. These are some of the outlets which spout the most racist drivel from their best paid journalists. This is not just about comments, this is about structurally what that organisation does. Probably, and this is probably the most significant and appalling sort of instance of inciting racial hatred from the Times, is something that appeared not in the comment section, not in the op-ed section, but on the front page. So here you've got Christian child forced into Muslim foster care. Now, this sparked, a huge row. Everyone's like, how's political correctness gone so mad that you're forcing Christian children into Muslim foster care? It's sort of playing into all the worst tropes that come from sort of far-right anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, which is, young white children being forced into brown. It's really grim. A complaint was made about this, which was upheld because that front page, and again, this wasn't a comment section, this wasn't in the op-eds, that was a front page, was fundamentally wrong. So Ipsos upheld a complaint because the fact of the matter was the child was at least as Muslim as she was Christian. She was baptized, but she had regularly attended church. In the care of her practicing Muslim grandparents. The family, again, was a divided family in terms of that they weren't all Muslim. I mean, the whole story completely fell apart. It was on the front page of the Times, and now a Times journalist is saying these comments would not appear in our paper, and trying to smear an anti-racist left-wing organisation, which is, by the way, funded on a shoestring. I mean, if the Times want moderators, they can pay for them. Trying to, in this really self-righteous way on Twitter, suggest that we're associated with racism. I can't stand it. Ash, I want to go to you on this because, I mean, obviously it's close to your heart as well because you're part of Novara Media, but I think you have seen over the past 4 years how brazen it is, this strategy by people who are members of basically right-wing organisations who literally pay people to go and stoke racial hatred out in the country, who then point at a left-wing anti-racist organisation and find the flimsiest evidence they possibly can, and then use their enormous platforms, often funded by billionaires who are more responsible than anyone else for xenophobia in this country. I'm looking at Rupert Murdoch here, and claim that a couple of comments on a YouTube channel mean that this left-wing organisation funded on a shoestring, which is trying to challenge right-wing narratives, is itself implicated in horrible racism.
I mean, Michael, I think you've put it better than I ever could have. This is clearly a bad faith attack. We put a lot of effort into moderating our comments. It's a sad and unfortunate truth that some will slip through the net, and when they do, we'll do our best to make sure those commenters can't comment again. I really appreciate and adore the commenting community that we've got for Tysky Sour. I think it's one of the most impassioned and intelligent audiences you could hope to have as a media organisation. And so I think it's absolutely outrageous that thousands of viewers are being tarnished with this brush. But the thing that I would like to say actually is not to you and it's not to our audience, it's to Rosamund Irwin herself, because Rosamund, you've blocked Aaron Bastani, you've blocked Michael Walker, but as far as I can tell, you haven't blocked me yet. And I've got no reason to think that you don't take racism very seriously. And as we've laid out in this show, there are racist comments below the line on the Times and Sunday Times YouTube channel. They've stayed up there for months. Some comments as ugly as advocating for mass repatriation or a race war. And we've also highlighted a pattern of coverage which is either explicitly racist and denigrating of Black people, of Muslims and ethnic minorities, or also just misleading, dishonest journalism. So I can only assume from the way in which you tweeted my colleague Michael Walker that you are either shockingly ignorant of the organisation of which you work for, or this is a bad faith attack and you're holding Novara Media to standards which no other media organisation could be held to, or perhaps you hold to a hierarchy of racism where you don't consider racism against black people and against Muslims to be as serious as anti-Semitism. Now, I really hope it's not the latter. So here's my question for you. Given we found a lot more than 2 comments on a single live stream highlighting a pattern of racist comments on the Sunday Times and Times YouTube channel, and also a pattern of racist commentary in the publication proper, what are you doing to stop racism within your organization? And I patiently wait for your answer.
I mean, her answer is going to be nothing. What I'm doing is I'm busy distracting from the racism of my own organisation by throwing stones at anti-racist progressive organisations who aren't funded by xenophobic billionaires, who aren't, who haven't spent decades stoking hatred against Muslims and trans people and put on their front pages scare stories which aren't actually true about white kids being forced into brown families, and this idea, and obviously, in a way, it feeds back to the Labour issue, because whilst, as we've always said, there were some real anti-Semites in the Labour Party, and more than there were some real anti-Semites, there was some sort of ways of speaking that made Jews rightly uncomfortable, and there could have been a bit more leadership from the top on it. But the purpose of making it out as if the Labour Party was the home of racism in this country was to absolutely distract from the powerful institutions in this country, who don't just have a few members who tweet things on Twitter, but who are literally owned and controlled by people who are willing to put lies on their front pages to incite hatred against powerless people who have either recently arrived in this country because they are coming from a war zone, who they're saying, this is disgusting, why can't they live in France? These people are criminals, giving huge platforms to Nigel Farage, who's going around beaches, sort of harassing people coming over in dinghies, harassing, in a metaphorical sense of his cam. I don't want to make any particular allegations about what he's done on the ground. But the fact that the purpose of these organizations and the way they make money is to stoke racial hatred. And then to say that actually, no, racism in Britain, the biggest problem is what people have written on Facebook and Twitter who are part of the anti-racist left-wing party. And then you get people on Twitter who sort of say, oh no, but it's a bigger deal when it's from the left because you're supposed to be anti-racist. So we're going to hold you to impossibly high standards because you're left-wing. If there is a single racist comment on your YouTube channel, that undermines your whole argument, that undermines the whole point of your being. And I say to them, look, we do hold ourselves to a higher standard, but if you are trying to make us commit to this sort of weird-ass double standard that you don't apply to anyone else and is impossible to meet, we're not going to do that because we would fail that and then you'd hold it against us, right? So let's be realistic about this and let's call out people who are only attacking us in bad faith. Ash, your final points on this and then we'll close the show.
I mean, I think part of the way in which anti-Semitism has been used to discredit the entirety of the left is the intention is to rob us of the ability to talk about racism at all. Exactly. Now, like you said, it is true that there are anti-Semites within the Labour Party, there are anti-Semites on the left, and more than that, there was also this broader lack of sensitivity and kindness, right? And a failure in leadership from the top of the Labour Party didn't deal with it as quickly as it should have. And I think that we can all agree on that. We might differ on what some specific policy responses should have been, but that's definitely true. The most fervent attackers of the left, from the right-wing papers and the right-wing media in general, do not take racism seriously. They don't take anti-Semitism seriously. So you've got the same people who are pushing this kind of, George Soros conspiracy theory from the front page of the Telegraph, for instance, right? That was Nick Timothy. Rupert Murdoch, who has talked about the Jewish-owned press, that these are somehow people who get a free pass because they're not associated with the left and they're not associated with the anti-imperialist left in particular. And I don't think that this is something that we talk about enough, is that part of the reason why there is this selective outrage with regards to anti-Semitism and perhaps a heightened sensitivity when it comes from the left, or is perceived to come from the left, is in part so that you can no longer talk about the way in which Islamophobia has shaped decades of state policy, both domestically and overseas, and to rid the left of its moral authority when it comes to structural and institutional discrimination. And that is a huge part of this story. Now, the challenge for the left, and I'm going to talk about the challenge facing the left because we do have a responsibility to make something better, to do something better, is to try and revive those bonds of anti-racist solidarity, which have historically existed between Jewish communities and other communities of colour within a shared anti-racist movement. And I think it's going to be really difficult, and I think it's been made more challenging in particular because of this, a heightened, very partisan conflict with regards to anti-Semitism. But that's the challenge that's facing us, because the rising tide of white nationalism endangers all of us. Endangers Jewish people, endangers Muslims, endangers Black people, presents a threat to trans people, to people who aren't straight. And so you really do have to have a kind of shared movement and shared language to deal with that. And that is precisely what this particular form of weaponization is designed to impede.
Love the passion with which you speak on this topic, Ash. And I mean, I just think you so clearly understand racism on a much deeper level than Rosamund Owen, who has this sort of temerity to be out there sort of on Twitter saying, well, we wouldn't allow these comments on our website. Anyway, we're not going to give the Times any more airtime than they deserve. But I think we can just conclude this by saying, if you want to smear this organization as racist, you better try harder. And it would probably help if you don't yourself work for a racism factory, right? Maybe you'd have a leg to stand on. First of all, maybe find something a little less tenuous than a couple of comments that appeared for 60 minutes in a live chat and slipped through moderators. And maybe you shouldn't be employed by an organization which is literally the biggest purveyor of hate on this island, frankly. Right, we're going to end the show there. First of all, let's go to some comments. We've got some great comments. Sal Stanifor with a tenner. Thank you very much. In case any Sunday Times journalists are taking screenshots, say hi to Rupert from me. Nishat 1976 with 1999. As a Muslim, I think Islamophobic outlets like the Times are an existential threat to me, but I expect more pathetic attacks on independent left media as the MSM struggles to maintain its relevance. Stay strong, NM. Thank you so much, Nishat. Very powerful comment there. Glyn Everett with a $5. Solidarity, Michael, your outrage here is so justified. Oh, and a huge welcome back to Ash. I like to think my outrage is justified. And also a huge welcome back to... Let's get another Ash reaction, please. We need as much of her on screen as possible because we've missed Ash Sarkar. We've got Tom Drucker, 1917. I presume the amount is signifying something. Thanks for keeping me sane over a long unemployed lockdown. Can now afford to support. Seems more important than ever. Solidarity. Thank you so much, Tom Drucker. It means the world. And Tarana Armada Parker with £4 and Patrick with £5. Thank you so much, both. Let's finish the show by just saying, we love our Tysky Sour audience because one of the things that this stupid story is trying to do, and they did it with the Labour Party as well, as they said, look, because there are a few people who've made bad comments, then this whole huge mass of people who all they want actually really is a better world. There are people who join the Labour Party, people who watch Tysky Sour. In general, the vast majority of you, the reason you join the Labour Party or watch Tysky Sour is because what you want is a fairer world where there is less exploitation, where there is less xenophobia towards people who are just looking for a better life. That's why you engage in this politics. And what articles like this are trying to do is to say, you have to prove you're not racist. Our assumption is going to be that all of you are suspect, all of you are sinister in some way. The mainstream press over the last 5 years managed to very successfully do that about the Labour Party, very successfully, to the point that the public largely accepted it. And in a way, that's because the defence from the Labour Party was often confused. And I don't think this was necessarily because they were selling out their members. It was because, they got tied up in absolute knots, didn't they? And on the one hand, what this meant is that they dealt with anti-Semitism in a cat-candid way, sometimes too slowly. On the other, it meant that they couldn't defend their members when they needed that defence. And we're not going to let that happen at Novara Media. We are going to make sure that we can, hold our heads up high with pride and say we do everything we can to make sure that this does this organisation does fulfil the expectations you would expect of a progressive anti-racist organisation. But also, when people come at us and try and smear us or smear our audience as suspect, as sort of very close to racism, as involved in something as horrific as anti-Semitism, we're going to call it out, okay? Because we're going to call it out. We love the community that is built up around this show. We aren't going to let anyone working for a Murdoch-owned racism factory do you down. Also, obviously, you're not welcome to comment if you're going to comment racist shit, but you know that already because that's the whole point of this show. Right, we're going to end there. Ash, it was such a pleasure having you back this evening.
I'm so glad to be back. Like, I think the worst thing about self-isolation and being ill is that I could only appreciate Tysky remotely. And I missed you guys an awful lot, and I missed being part of this show. And I miss being part of this family. It's going to take a lot more than a little bit of coronavirus to keep me away from you.
We missed you too, Ash. Okay, let's end it there. We'll be back on Wednesday at 7 p.m. for what will be another massive show, because we're going to have the American election results to contend with. I mean, again, as Sarah Jaffe was saying, we're not necessarily going to know who is the president at that point in time, but we will be a lot closer to knowing who will be in charge of the world's imperial hegemon for the next 4 years. As ever, if you have enjoyed the show and you want to support us, please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month so we can continue growing, building on the shows we already have, upgrading the technology, getting more stuff. I mean, we've got so many plans, trust me. In any case, thank you as ever for watching. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.